The recursive nexus of nature and nurture, the irreducible principle of integrated causality, the most foundational truth governing the entire lifespan, explicitly addressed by classic texts like Crane's Theories of Development and the comprehensive overviews by Burke and Santrock, is that development is not a result of either genetics, nature, or environment, nurture, but is the continuous probabilistic outcome of their recursive, integrated interaction. This principle establishes that all developmental outcomes, from cognitive milestones to social resilience, are a function of this inseparable nexus. The genotype-environment correlation and interaction, the synthesis of the theoretical texts, reveals that the nature versus nurture debate is fundamentally obsolete. The reality is a complex genotype environment, GE, correlation and interaction. Active correlation, individuals, guided by their genetic predispositions, genotype, actively select, modify, and even create environments that align with their inherent tendencies. A child predisposed to novelty-seeking, a genetic trait, will actively seek out challenging social groups and diverse experiences, which then further shapes their cognitive and social development, an environmental effect. This concept, discussed extensively in lifespan texts, lifespan development, human development, a lifespan view, means that individuals are not passive recipients of their environment, but are active agents in their own developmental trajectory. Interaction. The same environmental factor can have dramatically different effects depending on the individual's genotype. A stressful, high-risk environment might trigger severe pathology in a child with specific genetic sensitivities, while a child without those sensitivities might develop strong coping skills and resilience. The effect of nurture is thus conditional upon the state of nature. This probabilistic interaction explains the wide variance in outcomes, even among individuals sharing highly similar environments, e.g. siblings. Epigenetic modification. At the biological level, the recursive nexus is mediated by epigenetics. The environment, stress, nutrition, warmth, trauma, does not change the DNA sequence, but it changes which genes are expressed, turned on or off. The work of Bruce D. Perry, What Happened to You, and The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, provides visceral case studies demonstrating how chronic, overwhelming stress, nurture in early childhood, alters the biological machinery, nature, governing fear, arousal, and social connection. The trauma is literally embedded in the regulation of gene expression, proving that the environment directly regulates biological potential. The bidirectional influence of social development. The principle of integrated causality is powerfully evident in the domain of social development, Park, Roisman, and Rose. Development is fundamentally a social process where the individual is shaped by, and simultaneously shapes, the social context. The child-parent loop. The relationship between a parent and child is the clearest example of the recursive loop. A parent's style, nurture, affects the child's temperament, nature, and critically, the child's temperament, e.g., easy versus difficult, changes the parent's behavior, nurture. A challenging child can turn an otherwise calm parent into a stressed, less responsive caregiver. Alison Gopnik's The Gardener and the Carpenter speaks directly to this, contrasting the carpenter model, shaping the child toward a fixed design, with the gardener model, creating a rich, flexible environment where the child's unique nature can flourish. The gardener model is an embrace of the recursive nexus, the origins of morality, the development of morality and social consciousness, explored in texts like Paul Bloom's Just Babies, shows that even concepts as abstract as good and evil begin with innate biological predispositions, nature. Babies show early preference for fairness and helper figures, which are then profoundly elaborated, refined, or suppressed by cultural and familial teaching. Nurture. The moral self is not simply learned. It is a genetically rooted potential that requires a social environment for its realization. The contextual imperative. Finally, the recursive nexus requires a deep commitment to the contextual imperative, the idea that the process of development cannot be understood outside of its specific cultural, historical, and economic context. Lifespan development texts. Lifespan development cultural and contextual applications emphasize that meaning of milestones varies. The meaning and timing of developmental milestones, e.g., leaving home, career establishment, are heavily dependent on cultural scripts. Context shapes. Risk. Environmental risks, e.g., digital media exposure as discussed in Handbook of Children and Screens, or protective factors, e.g., community support, are highly contextual. A factor that is a risk in one context may be benign or even beneficial in another. In summation, the recursive nexus of nature and nurture is the ultimate truth of development. It asserts that the individual is a biological entity, programmed for adaptation, whose genetic potential is continuously expressed, regulated, and elaborated by the environment it inhabits and actively selects. Development is thus a probabilistic, co-constructed process where causality runs in both directions simultaneously. The primacy of plasticity and context-dependent organization, the irreducible principle of dynamic systems. The second core principle that synthesizes the neuroscientific, developmental, and trauma-focused texts is that the human system, brain, and mind is defined by its ceaseless adaptive plasticity, and that development is the context-dependent process of organizing and specializing this pliable structure to meet environmental demands. This principle moves from why development happens, Principle 1, to how it happens, through the dynamic reorganization of the neural and psychological architecture. The brain as a dynamic, experience-driven system. The neuroscientific backbone of this principle is the concept of primacy of plasticity. The brain is not a static machine that simply grows. It is a dynamic system whose very structure is shaped by experience. Experience, expectant and experience-dependent plasticity. Lifespan texts detail two mechanisms. Experience-expectant plasticity refers to the brain's preparation for species-typical experiences, e.g., language exposure, visual stimulation. Experience-dependent plasticity refers to unique individual learning, e.g., learning to read, which Proust and the Squid reveals is a profound, non-natural reorganization of visual and linguistic centers. Marianne Wolf's work shows that literacy is not simply a skill acquisition, but a rewiring of the brain's circuitry, demonstrating that complex cultural practices physically restructure the neural substrate. Synaptic pruning and specialization. Development is as much about subtraction as it is about addition. The brain overproduces synapses early in life, and then systematically prunes away the connections that are not reinforced by the environment. This pruning leads to specialization and organization. This is the biological mechanism underlying the shift from generalist potential to specialized function, a theme contrasted by David Epstein's range, which argues for the value of delaying this intense specialization in favor of broad, generalist exploration. The principle is that the environment dictates the survival of the connections. The context-dependent organization of trauma and resilience, the work of Bruce D. Perry, and the perspective presented in What Happened to You, offers the clearest, most profound evidence of context-dependent organization at the level of the developing child's brain. Hierarchical organization, Perry emphasizes that the child's brain develops from the bottom up, from the primitive brainstem regions responsible for core regulation, to the limbic system, emotion, and finally to the cortex, reason, complex thought. Trauma, context, during sensitive periods of this development, leads to a permanent reorganization that prioritizes survival over complex thought. For a traumatized child, the brainstem remains perpetually dominant, stuck in a state of hypervigilance. The organization of the brain has been contextually adapted to a world of threat. State-dependent functioning. This reorganization results in state-dependent functioning, where a child's cognitive and emotional capabilities are entirely dependent on their current physiological state, calm versus defensive, fearful. When stressed, the child reverts to the lower brain regions, losing access to the cortical regions needed for emotional regulation and complex problem-solving. Daniel J. Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson's The Whole Brain Child offers the practical application of this principle, teaching parents to first connect and calm the downstairs brain before attempting to engage the upstairs brain, the prefrontal cortex. The therapeutic intervention must respect the contextually organized hierarchy, developmental stages as organized adaptations, classic stage theories, though sometimes criticized, represent major, organized adaptive shifts in the overall system. Piaget's stages describe qualitative, context-influenced reorganizations of cognitive structures, how we think about the world, while Erikson's stages describe major, socially imposed reorganizations of the psychosocial identity, who we are, in the world. Adolescence as reorganization, Daniel J. Siegel's Brainstorm. The power and purpose of the teenage brain focuses on the major dramatic reorganization of the adolescent brain, which is characterized by hyper-emotion, novelty-seeking, and increased social engagement. This period is a final, highly plastic window where the brain realigns its social and risk assessment circuitry to prepare for independent adult life. The storm is not a pathology, but a necessary, context-dependent reorganization optimized for severing childhood dependency, midlife adulthood reorganization. Even in adulthood, development remains plastic. The quarter-life period, BIOC, is a socially and economically induced phase of reorganization where individuals, typically in their 20s and 30s, confront a new set of existential and identity challenges, requiring the system to reorganize its priorities, moving from external achievement to internal authenticity. In synthesis, the primacy of plasticity and context-dependent organization dictates that development is a ceaseless, active process of structuring the mind. The brain is not a blueprint, but a living clay shaped by experience. The purpose of this dynamic organization is always adaptation, to maximize the organism's fitness within the specific context of its life, whether that context is benign and language-rich or chronic and threatening. The teleology of adaptive identity and lifelong search for self. The irreducible principle of self-construction. The final principle unites the entire lifespan journey with the concepts of achievement, resilience, and personal meaning. Development is teleological, driven by an inherent lifelong psychological imperative to construct a coherent, integrated, and adaptive sense of self, identity, that mediates the demands of the external world and the potential of the internal world. This is the driving force that organizes the structural changes. Principle 2, initiated by the causal inputs. Principle 1, identity as the integrative achievement. The pursuit of identity serves as the central organizing theme for the entire lifespan, as described by Erikson and detailed across the comprehensive texts. Identity is the successful, functional outcome of integrating one's roles, abilities, and life narrative. The narrative self. Identity is intrinsically linked to the concept of the narrative self, the story we tell ourselves about who we are and who we will become. The major psychosocial crises described in developmental theory, e.g. industry versus inferiority, intimacy versus isolation, are moments of narrative testing where the self-story is either reinforced or fractured. Successful navigation results in an integrated identity that provides coherence and purpose. The search for self. Texts on adulthood, like Quarter Life, show that the search for identity is not resolved in adolescence. It recurs as new social and economic contexts place new demands on the individual's sense of purpose. The entire lifespan is a continuous process of self-construction and reconstruction in response to life events. The mindset of adaptive identity, Carol S. Dweck's mindset. The new psychology of success provides a powerful mechanism for how the self-construction drive is either fueled or stalled. The core concept is that the beliefs the individual holds about their own attributes profoundly influences their adaptive trajectory. Fixed versus growth mindset. A fixed mindset, believing abilities are innate and unchangeable, undermines the teleological drive by preventing effort and interpretation of failure as an irreparable flaw. A growth mindset, believing abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work, aligns perfectly with the principle of adaptive identity, framing effort and failure as necessary data points for the system's self-correction and plastic growth. Principle 2. Mindset is essentially the psychological operating system that determines whether the individual engages with or retreats from the demands of development. The drive for resilience, the construction of an adaptive identity, is inseparable from the development of resilience. Books like Raising Resilience and the trauma-focused works emphasize that resilience is not an inherent trait, but a process. The capacity to engage the growth mindset under conditions of stress, utilizing external supports, social networks, to modulate the internal biologically imprinted stress responses. Perry's work. Resilience is the successful construction of a narrative self that includes the trauma while refusing to be defined solely by it. The teleology of integration and generativity. The final stages of development are characterized by a shift in the teleology of the self, from individual achievement toward generativity and integrity. Generativity. The imperative shifts from "what am I" to "what will I leave behind?" This involves investing in the next generation, mentoring and contributing to the social world. This is the adaptive necessity of ensuring the continuity of the species and the culture, marking a final integration of the personal self into the collective context. Integrity. The final task is the achievement of ego integrity, looking back on one's life with a sense of acceptance and coherence, realizing that the narrative, with all its errors and successes, was necessary. This requires the successful integration of all the past developmental reorganizations and crises into a unified, meaningful whole. In synthesis, the teleology of adaptive identity asserts that the entire lifespan is governed by a persistent internal drive to construct a viable, functioning, and meaningful self. This self is the psychological entity that engages the recursive nexus of nature and nurture and dictates the utilization of the brain's plasticity. The goal is not merely survival, but the achievement of coherence, competence, and connection within a constantly changing world.